All right, good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I think we got a good number of folks here. So my name is Rich Boyd. I'm the Assistant Division Chief of the Transportation and Toxics Division here at the Air Board. I'd like to welcome everybody to our Freight Days. And just so everybody understands, we're doing this listening session over 2 days. So this is the first of 2 days. Today, we intend to talk about seaports, rail yards, and border crossings. And on Thursday, we'll pick up warehouses, airports, and our secret process. And so these meetings are your opportunity to share with us your concerns, your experiences, suggestions for how our freight-related efforts can benefit all Californians and how we can best make the regulatory process serve you. And I'll pause for the translators.
I'm sorry, there is somebody in the other room, or do you want me to? Okay, my apologies. I'm so sorry. Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Boyd. We're going to basically start the today with this conference. Thank you for being here. My apologies. I saw there was somebody in the Spanish room translating. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so before we get started with the rest of the session, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, who's going to go over our Zoom housekeeping procedures so that folks know how to participate.
Antes de seguir con hoy, voy a pasarle la voz a Amanda Anderson, que nos va a dar los lineamientos de cómo manejar, hacer lo que tengamos que hacer en esta sección. Gracias.
Thank you. Let me get these started. Oops, sorry, I'm still sharing my music and don't want that.
Ahorita todavía apagando lo de la música, disculpen.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, disculpen acerca de eso.
Right, so we are recording this meeting, so we'll be able to access it later. And then in order to access translation, there is a globe at the bottom of your screen.
De manera de ustedes poder tener la interpretación, hay un globo en la parte abajo de la pantalla.
So when you click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen, you'll select Spanish, and then you can mute the original audio if you don't want to hear the English in the background.
Si ustedes quieren escuchar la interpretación en español, básicamente vayan a ese globo, lo aprietan y de esa forma se desconectan de la conversación en inglés.
And if you're on a cell phone, you'll see 3 dots in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll select that, and under the More menu, you have the option for interpretation.
Y si está en el celular, va a ver que hay como 3 puntos. Ustedes van a apretar ahí y van a darse cuenta de que eso los va a llevar al área donde tienen que accesar para obtener la traducción en español.
If you're calling into this Zoom meeting, you won't have the ability to access simultaneous translation.
Si usted está llamando para accesar a esta conferencia, no va a poder tener acceso a la traducción simultánea.
So you'll need to call into the Spanish conference line, and that phone number is 866-803-2146.
De otra forma va a tener, como dice en la pantalla, llamar al número de la conferencia en español que está en la pantalla. El número es 866-803-2146. Repito, 866-803-2146. Y la contraseña es 1083550. Repito, 1083550.
Thank you. Are there any questions about how to access translation during this meeting?
¿Hay otra pregunta acerca de cómo accesar la traducción en esta reunión?
Okay. If there's no questions, we'll go ahead and end sequential translation now.
Si no hay ninguna pregunta, vamos entonces a irnos a la interpretación secuencial. Ujú.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Okay, so the settings that we have today is you'll be muted when you come into the meeting, but if for whatever reason you do become unmuted, please check and make sure that we're staying muted throughout the meeting so that we're not getting disrupted. And then we would ask if you have an organization that you're representing to please add that to your name. So if you'd like to change your name, in the top right corner of your screen, there's 3 dots, and that will be one of the options there. If you need help with that, please feel free to send a chat to me directly. And then in order to mute and unmute, there is the symbol at the bottom left hand of your screen or the top right of your screen for the microphone. So, sorry, it got muted. So you'll be able to use that to mute and unmute yourself. However, since we'll be having you raise your hand, you'll get a message from the host asking you to unmute. And if you're calling over the phone, you'll select *6 to mute and unmute yourself. You also have the option to turn your cameras on and off. That symbol is right next to the microphone, either in the bottom left or the top right of your screen. So we encourage you to use your cameras if you're comfortable, especially when you're talking. And then we'll be utilizing raise hand today if you'd like to share a comment or ask a question. So that can be in 2 places depending on which version of Zoom that you have. It will either be under your participant list at the bottom, there'll be an option to raise your hand, or you'll see it in your reactions menu. If you're calling in over the phone, you'll select *9. However, occasionally that feature does not work for those who are calling in. So what we'll do is we'll ask if there's any comments from the phone lines periodically throughout the meeting. And you can go ahead and mute or unmute yourself at that time. And then we're also using the chat feature today. So that chat will allow you to share with everybody that's in the meeting, or you can privately chat the co-host or the host. If you don't see it, the chat icon should be at the bottom of your screen, and it looks like a message bubble. Please feel free to ask questions and to comment in the chat. We'll be pulling up questions from there and asking that to our panelists throughout the day. And we'll also be saving the chat for our records as well. We'll be providing links within the chat, and then if you would like any follow-up information, you can message me directly. My name starts with a star, so it should be one of the first that you see in the drop-down menu. And if you'd like to receive follow-up emails with the recordings of this event and a certificate acknowledging your participation, please send your contact information to me in the chat. And again, you can do that privately. Okay. And then the last thing that I'll share is we're using Poll Everywhere software today to get your feedback. So the way that you'll access that is either through your computer web page, and you'll use the links there, or you can text CARB EJOCAB 306 to that phone number. And I will put those instructions in the chat in just a moment. So what we'd like to do is go ahead and test a poll question to make sure that it's working for everyone. So as you can see, the instructions for how to access the polling are there, either by going to pollev.com and then entering the username CARB EJOCAP 306, or you can text CARB EJOCAP 306 to 22333. We'll go ahead and activate that question. Awesome. So we're seeing some responses come in. And this will show as a word cloud, so the responses that get repeated will come up larger. Okay. Did anyone have any trouble accessing that? Okay. And I will add the instructions into the chat. So those instructions are in the chat, and once you do either do it through your web page or through your text, leave that open throughout the day and you'll be able to answer questions as they come up. Okay, and then I'll turn it back over to Rich.
Thanks, Amanda. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have our Freight Day session structured over 2 days. And again, just as a reminder, today we'll be talking about seaports, rail yards, and border crossings. But before we dive into those particular topics, we have the pleasure of having our Deputy Executive Officer for Environmental Justice with us today. And she's going to give us a keynote address. And just so folks know, Chanel is responsible for developing our board-wide environmental justice policies, and plays a key role in those programs to address disproportionate impacts from air pollution and climate change across the state. So without too much more, I will turn it over to Chanel.
Wow, thank you, Rich. And thank you everyone that could join. I'm really excited to be here. I feel like this morning I started with kicking off the scoping plan and talking about environmental justice. So it's nice to end my day here with everyone talking about environmental justice, particularly as we're thinking about freight and the impacts of it. So just kind of so folks know, I think things that I wanted to cover, I wanted to kind of just do some general framing around environmental justice. I feel like we very often use terms like environmental justice, racial equity, we throw them around. We don't necessarily, I think, define them, talk about how we're operationalizing them. So that is one thing that I wanted to do. I did want to talk a little bit about what CARB is doing agency-wide. And then I wanted to kind of end on some of the things I think that we're talking about and that we're thinking about in regards to freight and environmental justice communities. So that is the plan, and I will get started. Just so folks know about me, I actually come from the advocacy space. I spent about almost 20 years working in advocacy, and if you've ever worked as an advocate, the job is always about, right? It's like, how do we push? And then I think in my 4 months of being in government, what's been really interesting is it's how do you receive that pushing and understand the intent, right? Which is always really about thinking about how are we as government and we as advocates working together to really embody and realize environmental justice. One of the things that I think is interesting when I started was understanding that in statute, there is a definition for environmental justice. And that definition is the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, right? And when we talk about that, right, it's obviously in reaction to the fact that there hasn't been fair treatment of all people of races and cultures and incomes when we're talking about, when we're developing, when we're implementing, when we're actually enforcing those environmental laws. And so when I talk about environmental justice, I always want to ground that conversation to what I think it's in reaction to, which is environmental racism. When we talk about environmental racism, I just want to be clear that when I'm using that term, I'm talking about like the institutional rules and regulations and policies and government or corporate decisions that are targeting certain communities, right? And those communities happen to be Black communities, brown communities, right? Or I think we can say Black, Indigenous, people of color. Those are the communities that get targeted for these locally undesirable land uses, right? And we see those communities that are being disproportionately exposed to toxics and hazardous waste based on race. And I think it's really important that we start to center that conversation. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to see fair treatment for everyone, but we want to be clear and intentional that not everyone has had fair treatment. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging that, in fact, we, right? And when I say we, that is government. Government has been intentional in actively facilitating that space where some people have gotten better treatment than others. So really, when we're doing this work around environmental justice, it's really focused on thinking about how are we bringing in that lens of justice, and justice really comes to that place of how are we redressing some of those harms, and what does that look like, and what does that mean? And that's a really, it's a really big question for government, particularly when you're in it, right, to think about that. So I think with that kind of big framing, I think the reality is, right, is that we at CARB, I think, have inherited a lot when we're talking about environmental justice, when we're talking about environmental racism, when we're talking about the disproportionate impacts of air pollution. We've inherited decisions, we've inherited statutes, we've inherited policies that are not benefiting BIPOC communities. And now we have an opportunity to think about, well, what are we doing to address that? And what are we doing in the future to change that? I can share a little bit of what we're doing, but I think I really want to kind of set expectations appropriately, that this is very much a work in progress. And I know that is frustrating to hear. I myself feel that frustration in some ways, but it's a work in progress because what we're doing is, like, from the inside out, we're actively changing how we do the work that we do, how we think about the policies that we develop, right? So for example, when we're talking about the end goal is how do we reduce, like, you know, the pollution, like from diesel. We're not just thinking about, like, okay, so scientifically, what's the best and easiest option to get there? We're now thinking about what are the impacts of communities, what is the health impacts, and how do we develop, you know, those policies, those regulations to take into account those communities that historically weren't taken into account in the past, right? Which is how we got here. So some of the things that I think we're doing to think about and to kind of, again, like advance environmental justice, right, and react to that environmental racism, we're thinking about who has been invested in and who has not been invested in historically, and what can we do in some ways to right that. And part of that is through, I think, a lot of the grant programs that we have at CARB, right, those ones that are community focused. Some of those are within, like, Office of Environmental Justice. Some of those are within other divisions. But we're really thinking about and being conscientious that we realize that, just like I mentioned, right, just due to the history that we're dealing with, you know, there are many communities that have not been invested in, that don't have had the resources. And so how do we make sure that we're taking those funds and using those funds in a way where we could start to help communities build their own capacity, particularly around, like, what I am breathing in, right? So basic, like, air monitoring, like, what am I breathing in? Thinking about, like, what are the kind of transportation projects or what are the kind of land uses that you do want to see, and how do we make sure that you have some of those resources? So that's just kind of like the grant making piece of it. We're also thinking about our own guidance on environmental justice. And if you are, if you've been at CARB for a while, or if you're, like, an expert at Google and you've Googled environmental justice and CARB, one of the things that will come up is this report that we did in 2001 on environmental justice policies. And when we did that, we had an environmental justice unit. And I think there was some conversation around, well, environmental justice should be everywhere in the organization, right? So that kind of got disbanded, people got spread around. And then we realized that what really should be happening is both, right? Like we should have, I think, we should have those people that are focused on and dedicated to environmental justice to help kind of continue to guide and shape how we're doing that. And we should really be facilitating and creating a culture where everyone feels that responsibility and that ownness for environmental justice. And so part of the ways that you can do that, right, is kind of taking those documents, updating them, updating the guidance for it, and then thinking about like, what does that implementation look like and how do we track that implementation? So that's one thing that's been an ongoing conversation in the Office of Environmental Justice has been, how do we take this tool from 2000 or this kind of report from 2001 and actually think about like what it looks like to update that and use it as a resource. Other things that I think we've been thinking about is what does it actually mean to operationalize environmental justice? And so when we say that, what is it? What are the expectations that we are setting with the community? What is the accountability? And how are we actually making sure from the very beginning to the very end that we're thinking about those environmental justice principles and making sure that they're being built in and reflected through all of our processes. And that's a challenge. I mean, I think I just want to keep kind of reinforcing that all of these things are challenging, especially when that's not how I think government was built. And so a lot of what we're doing is changing, I think, again, from the inside out, the very DNA of how government was built. But, and so part of it means that we're trying to be both proactive in terms of thinking about where are the places where we know, that like from the start, this is where we want to see those principles of environmental justice reflected. This is kind of like the analysis that we want to include in it. These are the communities that we want to engage with. And, these are the questions that we want to ask, right? So that's some of those proactive questions we can do. But it also does involve being reactive, right? Because we're not all seeing, we're not going to know everything. And so there is a real question of how do we allow ourselves to be flexible, to be open, to react, to change, and to be malleable. And I think most importantly, to be collaborative and to be transparent, right? And I think those are things that I think whenever we're talking about, I would say environmental justice, and a subset of that, right? Like community engagement that are going to be essential, I think, for ourselves and government, but also in terms of partnering with communities. I think the other point that I would make on this front is really, really emphasizing how important racial equity is. And that's another, I feel like, in terms of things that have become like buzzwords, racial equity is definitely one, right? Racial justice, racial equity. And part of that is the political climate that we're in and people becoming aware. Part of that is people just becoming more like well-resourced as books are coming out and people are taking charge of their own knowledge and education, which I'm in full support of. But when we talk about racial equity, the goal is that, racial equity is realized when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved. So that's really what we're shooting for, what's really what we're looking at and what we're thinking about. And part of that, I think, for us at CARB is really thinking about what are those kind of internal efforts that we're doing to start to assess equity, right? So that means that I think, and I think it's hard, right? Because I'm realizing this is part of that kind of like transparency and collaboration, is that there are actually a lot of divisions, TTD, right? Transportation and Toxics divisions is one of them, that are doing listening sessions that are really thinking about how we are, how are we kind of taking in that feedback? How is it shaping our regs? And so part of it is, how do we do some of that work and start to think about across divisions within our agency of what that looks like? Other parts include, I think, what does it look like to actually build that into our actual regulatory process? And it's a bigger conversation, right, of thinking about that. We have some of these things that we're thinking about in terms of looking at developing a racial equity narrative, right, and a framework that starts to kind of show and identify, like, what does that mean when we say racial equity? What are we talking about? How does that show up at CARB? And then an actual kind of like assessment. And then the idea is that this isn't meant to be check the box things, but it's meant to really help divisions start to think about and go through a process and ask themselves the questions of who am I talking to? How am I thinking about impact? How am I thinking about burden? Is this going to cause a burden? And if so, then who are we talking to address some of those things? And kind of, again, like those proactive pieces. And then there's a lot of the work that we're doing, I think, internally to shift some of the culture at CARB as well. And we're really thinking about some of that's happening through different training efforts that we're doing around like investing in our staff and really focusing on like racial equity training. Some of that's happening in some of the task force that we created to really think about like our own hiring and outreach and how we're building up cultural competency. And some of that is just honestly like us implementing the resolution that came from our board in October to create this Office of Racial Equity and to really think and be thoughtful about its role. And a lot of that, I think, I just wanted to give some framing because sometimes I think it can be easy to come in a room and start to focus on like the topic at hand. But I want people to know that what we're talking about and what we're doing around environmental justice and what we're doing around racial equity, there is obviously a clear connection there, but it's not just going to be siloed to kind of just certain pieces and certain divisions, but that instead we're really thinking about a broader, kind of more impactful strategy agency-wide. I know today that the focus is really, I think, on freight, as noted by these are the freight days. I think some of the things that I feel like we've already heard in listening sessions, and we know, right, like we know are kind of like gonna come up and we are thinking about, right, is that there's like the number of like delivery trucks and the idling that's happening in communities, for example. We know that like environmental justice communities are unfairly burdened with a number of like warehouses, right? And that's, I mean, I remember flying down to the Inland Empire a couple of years ago and being like, oh my God, there's so many warehouses. And then I came back like maybe it was a year or two ago, obviously before COVID. And I was just, I mean, overwhelmed at how many more warehouses had been built, right? We're thinking about the rail yards, particularly around that noise pollution, in addition to, I think, the health impacts, right? None of this is a surprise because we know that the communities that are being targeted for this are the same communities that have been targeted, right? And these are those BIPOC communities. And so really wanting to kind of emphasize that this is, when we talk about environmental racism, right? Like we see what's happening and we see it continuing. And so there really is a question of like, what are we doing to change that and to shift that? And it's part of it is like, what is CARB itself doing, right? And how do we get like, think about that operationalizing, I knew I was gonna say it, operationalizing environmental justice. And also thinking about how are we continuing to partner with communities to make those things happen. And then the places where I think we're like, we you know, whether it's we don't have authority, we don't have, et cetera, how are we being creative and using what we do have to shape some of those? So I know that my time is wrapping up. So I will say that I'm very excited to be here, to listen in, and I think to kind of to answer questions, but also I think to flag some of those places that I think it's important for us to have those conversations. I know there's a whole conversation around, you know, zero admission. That's really important. And I think there's also a question of like what happens in the interim, because a lot of these regs are so like far reaching looking out. And I think I want to encourage us to be open. I want to encourage us to be honest. I want to encourage us to be direct. And I think for us on the receiving end of CARB, I want to encourage us to listen and to hear the intent of what is being shared and to know that these are kind of the tools that we're going to need to make some of these changes. So thank you guys so much for having me. And I really, really appreciate it. And I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Rich.
It's all good. Yeah,
My
thanks.
apologies, Rich. Sorry, Rich. My apologies. I just saw Amanda's face and I was like, oh, Amanda. But no, it's Rich. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Chanel. Thanks, Chanel. So now is the time where we're going to get into our individual topics. And just so folks understand the flow, we're going to have folks who are going to be capturing notes during the discussion. Our intent is to make these notes publicly available, shortly after, both sessions have occurred. And just so that we can make sure that we're capturing your comments and suggestions and whatnot accurately, the note takers may need to cut in just to make sure that they understand the point being made so it can be captured correctly. Beyond that, we'll go through each topic. We'll have a short presentation. Then after each presentation, we'll have discussion, and there'll be some poll questions that we have that are going to be interlaced throughout that. So without too much ado, the first topic will be seaports. And so I will turn it over to Nicole Light-Dinsberger, who will walk us through the presentation. Nicole?
Great, thank you, Rich. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right.
Yep.
So good evening, everyone. As Rich mentioned, my name is Nicole Light-Dinsberger, and I'm with the Marine Strategy section here at CARB. I'm going to try to work through the presentation nice and slowly so the translators can keep up. So today, what I wanted to do is walk you through a high-level introduction to seaports and the associated freight sources that impact the air quality and the health of our seaport communities here in our state. I also want to provide you with a brief look at some of the regulations that CARB has adopted or is currently working on to tackle emissions from freight sources that impact our portside communities. And finally, I want to briefly talk about some of the existing ways that CARB staff interact with community members. Our main goal during this session is really to hear from you about what your main areas of concern are surrounding these seaport freight sources. We also want to hear from you about what your suggestions are as to how we as CARB staff can better make ourselves more available to you, and also how we can help make your participation in our rulemaking efforts easier and more productive. Next slide, please. So we'll start the presentation with a quick introduction to seaports. As most of you are probably very aware, seaports they're vital players in the transportation of goods. Over 90% of goods travel by sea at some point during their lifespan, and that includes many of the clothes and shoes that we wear, and also the electronics that we use on a daily basis. And there could be a quiz on this statistic later, so remember that 90% fact. And as a large coastal state, California has numerous ports. They're both public and private. And these ports move all sorts of goods to and from all corners of the world. And this can include containerized cargo, bulk liquids, things like oil and fertilizers, cars and machinery, and also passengers on board the numerous cruise ships that come in and out of our ports. Now, seaports are one of the main transportation hubs that facilitate the distribution of freight across California. And cargo moves via ocean-going vessel, hovercraft, via cargo handling equipment, locomotives, and trucks. So a wide variety. And the transportation of freight and passengers through our state's seaports is an essential part of California's economy. It generates over 5 million jobs and over $700 billion in revenue. But as many of you on this call are aware, they're also a major health burden to many Californians that live and work in our port communities. So next slide, please. And the majority of freight transportation equipment in use at our seaports is still powered by diesel engines. And that includes many of the vessels and harbor craft that maneuver in and out of the ports and dock at the berths, and also the cargo handling equipment, trucks, and trains that move that cargo on and off the ships, through the port, and then out into the surrounding communities. So the exhaust generated by this diesel-powered equipment, it gives off oxides of nitrogen, or also called NOx, particulate matter, or PM, greenhouse gases like CO2, and other pollutants. Now, the emissions associated with this freight transportation equipment at seaports contributes to the unhealthy regional levels of ozone and fine particulate matter, and it can lead to elevated cancer risks and other negative health effects, including higher risk of cardiac and respiratory diseases and premature death for those living in close proximity to our ports. Next slide, please. So emissions do come from many different freight sources at our ports. Slide 4 here shows some of the main freight emission sources at our seaports, and that again includes ocean-going vessels, commercial harbor craft, drayage trucks, locomotives, transport refrigeration units, or TRUs, as you'll hear us call them, and also cargo handling equipment. So CARB has existing programs that's designed to reduce emissions from each of the freight sources that are pictured here on this slide. And these programs are really key to reducing the health impacts of seaport activity on its surrounding port communities. Regulations for these seaport freight sources are developed and implemented by the Transportation and Toxics Division, or TTD, again, as you'll hear our division called. And we do this in conjunction with our planning, research, and enforcement divisions here at CARB within our agency. And this joint effort really helps to ensure that our freight regulations are, based on strong policy and science, and it also ensures that our regulated industries are complying with our requirements. And we also work closely with the Office of Community Air Protection, or OCAP, staff we make sure that community members' voices and concerns are heard throughout the rulemaking process when we're developing any of these freight regulations. Now, each of the regulatory programs for the sources that are pictured here on this slide are handled by either the Freight Transportation Branch or the Freight Activities Branch within TTD. And we'll be providing some program-specific links and also contact information at the end of this presentation so that you know who to reach out to or where to go to find out more information about any specific questions you might have about any of the regulatory programs for the sources you see here. And also, when we're done with this brief presentation on seaports, we're going to be asking you to take a poll to identify which of these, seaport freight sources are concerning you the most. And then we can share some additional information about those specific programs during the discussion section of today's Seaport session. So next slide, please. And while CARB's existing freight programs, they've helped push many of these freight sources towards lower emissions, we know that more work needs to be done. And CARB staff is actively working to expand the emissions reductions achieved from each of these programs. Now, slide 5 here shows a useful graphic of all of CARB's current freight regulatory actions and when those actions are expected to go to our board, to CARB's board for approval. A development of most regulations involves really a significant amount of economic analysis and technology evaluation, as well as an extensive public process. And this can often result in some extended rulemaking timeframes. But our staff are really working hard to develop and push these necessary regulations as quickly as we can to accelerate the health benefits of these programs. And while also trying to balance the fact that we're often sort of pushing the boundaries of some of this technology development. And as you can see here, several regulations, including multiple truck-related programs and the ocean-going vessels at-berth regulation, went to CARB's board for approval and adoption over the last 3 years. And coming up later this year in 2021 is the zero-emission truck regulation, the zero-emission TRU regulation, the Advanced Clean Truck Fleet regulation, which includes drayage trucks, and the Commercial Harbor Craft regulation. Now, CARB is dedicated to reducing freight-related emissions at seaports, and that includes moving to zero emissions equipment wherever feasible. And as we move to 2023 and beyond, that focus on zero emissions regulations is expected to start really increasing as zero emissions technologies become more commercially available. Next slide, please. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, our goal for tonight is really to hear from you about what your concerns are and about how we can better engage with you on any seaport-related air quality concerns within your communities. Presently, CARB staff, we do engage with community members in a number of different ways, and that includes through public workshops, community meetings like we're having tonight, individual meetings between select CARB staff and community groups, or even individual residents at times if necessary, or through the submittal of your comments or public testimony at our board meetings. And we'd like to hear from you about what additional methods you'd like to see us try in order to help improve your ability to communicate and engage with us as CARB staff. And we'll present this as another polling question tonight. So please kind of be thinking, I think this will be at the end of the session be thinking about what methods would work best to help improve community engagement and to help you personally become more involved with CARB's rulemaking efforts. Next slide, please. And on this final slide, this is the contact information for each program, as well as a link to each program's website. And this should contain more details about our specific efforts for reducing emissions from each source. And please feel free to reach out to any staff with any program-specific questions you may have. That's all for my brief presentation this evening. So I think we're ready to move on to our first polling question. So I guess back to you, Rich.
Yes, thanks, Nicole. And yes, let's go ahead and get our first polling question up. And then Nicole made reference to best way to engage with us. We do have a couple polling questions on that, but that'll be at the end of all of the presentation. So we'll capture that at once. And so let's go ahead and get that first polling question up there. And so here the question is, which freight sources are most important to your community? And as you guys can see, as folks log on to Poll Everywhere, we get a live response, live feedback of the responses as they come in. And as you can see, trucks and locomotives right now are dominating the questions, or the responses, I should say. And so one thing that might be helpful to know, and this can be for all of them, but particularly from trucks and locomotives, as those are still driving, you can go ahead and drop in the chat and share some thoughts with us about what specific interests, or what specifically about trucks, what specifically about locomotives are driving that concern. For trucks, for example, is it their emissions? I mean, that should be a big part of it. How they're traveling through neighborhoods, things like that. Looks like ocean-going vessels are coming up in third. So also helpful there. What specific concerns do folks who live in port communities have about ocean-going vessels? And then I see transport refrigeration units and cargo handling equipment also coming up. So I do see a response in the chat. I need to make that larger so I can actually see it. A comment about trucks, their concentration in disadvantaged communities and the negative effect they have on folks' health is one of the concerns there. All right, so it looks like this one might be settling down. All right, let's try the next question. We got one more for you. So this question is, which of the following regulatory options would you prefer? There's two choices here. Choice A, require cleaner combustion now, as in the 2020s, and delay zero emission until about 2040. That's one option. And then a second option, no further requirements now, but require zero emission when available. And I'm still seeing a little bit of movement, but it does look like the preference amongst the responders is to require cleaner combustion now and bring on zero emission around 2040. And if you have any thoughts about what's driving your particular selection, by all means, drop those in the chat so we can see those. We'll give this one a few more seconds. Look like there's still some activity as we get to see these come in live. Okay, looks like, oh, okay, there's a interesting little change right there. Okay, we'll give it just a few more seconds. So it looks like we're evenly split between the two different approaches. We do got some questions coming, some responses coming into the chat. Basically, we can start to phase in electrification now for trucks, hovercraft, cargo handling equipment. Why can't we maintain the zero emission goal for 2030? It looks like a couple of folks had some issues with the question. So by all means, if there's a different way that we should be approaching that, let us know. Okay, so it looks like so I was about to say, it looks like we have some stability in the responses, and there's a little difference there. Well, let's go ahead and close this one. I want to make sure that we have time for some questions and discussions on that. And so at this point, we'll go ahead and open the floor for comments. And just as in our previous sessions, we don't use a time clock. This is not a board hearing. We want to make sure that we hear from everybody. At the same time, we do ask that people be mindful of others who may wish to make a comment, and use that to kind of guide your length. And so with that, we will start taking questions and comments.
Okay, first I'm going to start with a few people raising their hands, and I will unmute you. The first one is Rafael Yanez, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Please correct me. Thank you.
No, you're good. Rafael Yanez, City of Los Angeles, Bureau of Sanitation's EJ team. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this presentation. Yeah, in the chat, I was putting, why is the question being asked this way? We in a lot of the EJ communities are echoing the need for cleaner diesel and cleaner combustion engine now, and are advocating for zero emission sooner. So given that, we're looking for, and developing rules in and around the South Coast Air Quality Management District, for instance, pushing towards zero emission trucks, sooner. But, we still are having this issue in EJ communities with a lot of diesel and gasoline powered engines that are constantly polluting the community. And then with the ever expanding rail yards in a lot of these EJ communities, it brings more truck traffic, more locomotives and whatnot. And it just seems like it's just getting worse and worse. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now the next person is Joelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joelle Tony. I'm a representative of the Red, Black, and Green Environmental Justice Coalition. I first wanted to thank Chanel and CARB for grounding this conversation in environmental justice principles and acknowledging the role that government has played in historically continuing the racism that our communities are facing. My biggest issue is with the either or question that we were just posed with, because I live in West Sacramento, and my neighborhood is sandwiched between a highway, a port, rail stations, and we have it all. And I'm wondering why, if we require cleaner combustion now, we would have to delay zero emissions. Is there not a way that we can do both? Because it's kind of like asking poor communities, like, do you want to suffer now if you don't have to? If we can promise you something that's probably not going to happen on time later. You know what I'm saying? And so I really disagree with asking us that question. And I hope that you all can work together to protect our communities now, while also holding folks accountable who are polluting our communities in the future for zero emissions. My second point is that while these folks are making money trucking into our communities, pulling freight and product here and there, while we're breathing dirty air, can CARB consider a compensation plan for communities that are impacted? I've been reading a lot of papers that talk about compensation games, where people who are impacted by the pollution are given a dividend of the money that is made from them being polluted. So that would be something that I'm interested in CARB considering. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Joelle. Thank you for your input. The next hand raised is Mary Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Jolie. I was shocked at that either or question myself. I'm over in Stockton, California, and we have a port. We have rail hubs, and we have an ever increasing number of warehouses that are coming into our community, both in the central area and, farther south. And so my concern is that there has to be something done now that has a real benefit on the exposure that we all have in these communities. And it's shocking to hear at a Port of Stockton meeting yesterday that they're buying a new truck, a new diesel truck. And when asked, this was like a major, advancement in the community outreach, that even the commissioners, read the comment and then asked the question of staff, had they even considered, an electric vehicle for the purpose, which was to go back and forth to the east and west side of the port area. So, we're not talking about, like some long-term, long, far-ranging, truck mobility necessity. And so they said, oh, well, we got this grant from CARB or the Air District to do an inventory of all of our vehicles. And, I'm just like, totally had it with, putting these things off when there's clearly the ability to do so. And so I appreciate, that bonus, but money doesn't bring back health, and so if we don't have some way to, like charge these people for, making money off of our air, so that, we can have a better condition. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to take a minute and let the panelists respond to some of the comments that have already been made.
Hi, this is Layla Gonzalez. I'm one of the panelists. My focus is mainly on locomotives and the locomotive regulation, draft locomotive regulation. And I just wanted to say, we really appreciate the comments that have been made so far. And I mean, it's something that we're definitely hearing you. and we're going to take this back and really mull it over. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Kuros. I'm another one of the panelists here and involved with some of the regulatory development efforts in our division. I want to apologize for any confusion that question only providing two options, neither of which were optimal. I just wanted to give a little bit more background about the nature of that question. In some sectors, there's a clear path to go to zero emission in the near term. I see some discussion in the chat about trucks and yard trucks having a lot of opportunity in the near future. In other sectors, for example, on some of the diesel-powered harbor craft, perhaps some of the more high-duty cycle cargo handling equipment, and perhaps some of the locomotives, there's opportunities not for clean combustion because we recognize that clean is a goal that zero emission equipment achieves, but there's an opportunity for cleaner combustion that is used now. And something that we have to consider and do consider is that when industry does make an investment in something that's cleaner, there's a period of time that they are expecting to use that equipment before going on to something next, whether that be a second round of cleaner combustion or zero emission technology. So we're just trying to understand, and perhaps that should have been a more sector-specific question, but I just wanted to explain that a little bit more. So to whatever extent you can provide input on where you think zero emission technology is worth waiting for, that would be helpful for us.
Thanks, David.
All right, are there any other panelists that want to respond to any of the questions or comments that were made previously?
Okay.
Okay, so we'll answer a few more from the people with their hands up, and then we'll move on to the chat. LaDonna Williams.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. Let me see if I can fix my camera. Yeah, there we go. I wanted to say really thank you to Chanel for her EJ keynote that really opened up the meeting for me, because many times we don't really get to have discussions in detail about environmental justice really from the leadership. You guys mention it, but you really don't give a definition of what your thoughts or angles are and what does environmental justice mean. So I really appreciate her going into that. But I would like to say, as she mentioned, CARB being a work in progress, which seems like all of these air districts and water agencies and EPA folks are continually a work in progress. But at some point, we got to actually start making progress. And so if we're talking about working on the outside with community and relationships with agency and changing this culture, we're going to really have to change the culture. And by that, I mean, starting with these committees and these advisory committees and councils. If we're talking about real equities and fairness and real environmental justice, that absolutely should be throughout every agency. As we mentioned, we don't discriminate against, any race, creed, color, that kind of thing. Environmental justice should be in that as well, so that there is no question that an agency or an elected official or whatever is approaching this through an environmental justice or an environmental fairness lens, whether it's social justice, environmental justice, or what have you. But we need to start balancing that power. So if they're really about affecting change, residents and community groups, environmental justice community groups, need to have seats on the executive board not having to go through all these banana peel layers of discussions at these various levels of advisory roles that in the end gets voted down by the executives with the power. We need to be on these boards and have equal power and equal input and say so, especially as it relates to our environmental justice communities that are bearing the worst burdens and the most negative impacts economically, health-wise, and everything else. If we're going to change that, we need to be equally on the board with you guys.
Thank you, LaDonna. I think we were going to have Jessica Johnson talk about drayage trucks.
Okay, so hi there, I'm Jessica Johnston with CARB. I was trying to unmute myself in the meantime, but I think there's a couple comments. I know trucks in the past in community meetings that I've attended, they seem to be kind of one of those pieces of equipment that we see in our communities, our schools, and our neighborhoods. They tend to, park nearby. So I just wanted to address that, that's something that we hear frequently. It's not something new here. And it's something that we continue to try to work on as we work through the regulations. Specifically, I work on the drayage trucks. I worked on the previous regulation that was passed in 2007. And we're currently working for at least the drayage trucks that are coming in and out of the ports. We're looking at that transition towards zero. Beginning in 2023. We're looking at, what's the most aggressive schedule we can use to implement the zero emission at the kind of nearby those communities operating at the ports. So I know that it's something that comes up a lot. That's initially our starting focus for the zero emission heavy duty sector is in that drayage category. Not quite sure if there's any other questions. I'm happy to answer those. We're in that process of the rulemaking now, and we invite your comments at this point. I also see Tony on here. He can talk a little bit more about what they're doing in that last mile delivery sector as part of the advanced clean fleets rulemaking that we have at the moment. So.
Yes, I'll take that opportunity. Thank you. I'm Tony Brazil. I oversee a number of our diesel regulations as well as some of our efforts to go to zero emissions. I do want to make sure that people who are listening in is that the regulation adopted in 2008, the truck and bus regulation, is requiring all trucks to upgrade to the 2010 engines, which are the cleanest available engines today. And so people are going to have to retire their older trucks and replace those in the next couple of years. And then, as Jessica mentioned, going forward, we're looking at strategies, both at a manufacturer requirement to make engines even cleaner than they are now, starting in 2024. And that's a regulation that the board approved last year. It takes effect in 2024. And concurrently, we're working on these strategies to phase in zero emission trucks everywhere feasible as part of the strategy to support the efforts to convert the entire fleet to zero emissions by the 2045 timeframe. And so that would start as early as 2023, 2024 timeframe to start making that transition. And then of course, funding programs are supporting some early deployments, particularly in the drayage category. There's a lot of funding being directed there with the goal of getting more than 800 zero emission trucks on the road this year or early next. As part of that strategy as well.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm just doing a quick little time check just to make sure we have opportunity for everything. So I see we still got some raised hands, so let's move back to that. And LaDonna, I'm not certain if your hand was raised from before or if you have a second question. But Melissa, let's go back.
Okay, And I do want to check if there are any questions from the Spanish conference line also. All right, it doesn't sound like it. So we'll move down the raised hand. So Bill McGavern.
Yeah, thank you. Bill McGavern with Coalition for Clean Air. And since there are a lot of us who want to have much lower emissions now or in the very short term, we really need to do more to address dirty old diesel trucks. They need to either be cleaned up or retired. And so CARB has two rulemakings that can address that. One is the heavy duty inspection and maintenance rule, which is required by Senate Bill 210, which was passed in 2019. And interestingly, your graphic shows that having been adopted in 2020, which was originally the plan, but it actually is now slated to come to the board at the very end of 2021. So it's been a long time in the making. And so I urge everybody concerned about truck emissions to weigh in with CARB on a strong rule to require the dirty trucks to be caught and make sure that they are repaired, if not retired. And secondly, diesel trucks should be retired when they reach the end of their useful life, which is a number that is defined in law. And this comment applies especially to drayage trucks, but really to all trucks throughout the state. The emission reductions that we can get by retiring diesel trucks at the end of their useful lives are enormous, over 30 tons per day in 2030. And that estimate comes from CARB staff. And that can be done through the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which is coming to the board in December. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. The next person is Martha Armas Kelly.
Good afternoon, Martha Armas Kelly with Catholic Charities Environmental Justice Program. I'm just a little, I get it. You guys are, you're all on board. These words, equity and inclusion are really nice sounding and powerful words, but if we're not really going to use them in their, totality, I think it's important to, like Chanel said, she kind of gave us the opening of knowing that her frustration with, these concepts has been something of a challenge, and we're all learning. But in the interim of your learning, the agenda still has been present for many, many years. And for us to say that we're going to have zero emissions, and now we're kind of like saying, now you can take this now, and we may extend it longer, or we may, it's finagling of words. And I think that it has to stop. We have been working in these communities. We hear the voices of the people that are challenged, that are living in these disparities. And it's nice to think that, maybe some of you live in those environments, but I would venture to say that if you were living and you were having some of these issues facing you, you wouldn't be messing around with their timeline of adding more years for zero emissions. Just because now you're on board, that's great. We're excited. We want you to be mindful of equity and inclusion, but that is not going to make a difference for the people that are living in the disparities. So we need to have action now. It's not something that's negotiable. We're talking about people's lives, and for us to be, given an opportunity to be a team or on a committee where we can make some conversation and discussion and give inference and it's dismissed is almost like, come on, we respect our roles because we have people that count on us for our roles. So how can we better serve our communities and yourselves, better serve the communities that you are funded by and afforded by, to make a difference for folks? And the only way I see it is to allow us to have some type of voting where we can actually make some decisions and changes for the people that are being challenged and living in these disparities. No more ad hoc committee. That's not enough, because like someone had said, we go to the table, we give all the suggestions and ideas of what we know is right and should be changed and can be changed, lucrative even. You know, we're willing to work, you know, and help, but when does that change? So give us the teeth so that we can give something back to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Is there anyone who would like to speak to Martha's comments? Rich, I think you're muted if you are speaking.
Hi, Martha. Rich Boyd here. Just real quickly. Yeah, we hear what you're saying, and this is actually something that I wouldn't mind a more in-depth discussion on. You're raising some similar points that have come up from some others, and so if you could, like, if you feel comfortable, like, drop your information in the chat to Amanda Anderson. I'd like to reach out to you and talk about this a little bit more. And you're muted right now, Martha, if you're making a quick little follow-up comment.
Here we go.
I mean, I know I'm not alone, and I'm not trying to make this like the grievance board of all, you know, but we have to speak up. And I feel that I get it. You know, it's starting, it's moving. I mean, I'm part of PACE, which is, you know, the Partners Advancing in Climate Equity for the state. I'm one of your cohort members, and I've worked with many people in different committees and groups throughout the state of California. And I understand, but if we don't say anything and we stay salient, you know, and we just pretend that it's going to be something that's going to be addressed, let's do some meaningful engagement, some meaningful changes in how we structure things. The paradigm has to shift because people can't wait any longer.
I think Chanel has her hand up. I'm going to unmute you, Chanel.
Yes, go ahead.
So I'll chime in because my kid is like screaming in the background, so I think I'm gonna have to go pretty soon. I think a couple of things that I wanted to say, and I think, you know, Martha, to your point, I feel like what you're flagging and what's important for us to talk about is like a holistic government. And so I would say, like, right, for example, like PACE, amazing opportunity through the Strategic Growth Council, right? But part of that, what you're bringing up is that you're like, I am part of that process, and how is it not informing and shaping this process, right? And I think part of it is, again, on our end, on government, like, how are we being holistic? Because even though, like, you know, I think it's like, I'm talking to Strategic Growth Council, I'm talking to Caltrans, I'm talking to CTC, I'm talking to CARB. It's like, what are we doing to kind of start to kind of like take those conversations and thread them together? That to me is kind of like something that I hear in that, and I think it's really a call on our end, but also I think on the flip side of it, there's a real strong question around, as we're doing these kind of like, as we're doing these listening sessions and as we're doing these freight days and we're thinking more and more intentionally about community engagement, I think it's a real conversation for us that we're having within CARB of how are we, again, kind of being transparent, how are we being open and honest about the challenges that we're facing. And I think, and how do we have that conversation in a way where we're actually kind of like starting to share out and think through and work with communities to address those challenges. And that's, I think, something that, again, like I said, like, no one deserves to wait. And I'm not saying we should wait, but I think we're finally starting to grapple with those things. And so I just wanted to kind of comment on that. The other thing I wanted to talk about too is that I think in addition to that, I saw in the chat really around that piece around like that collaboration and those networks, which is in our environmental justice policies document, and how are we doing that and what are we doing on that front? And there really is, to me at least, it's like, it's amazing that we're having this conversation at TTD. It's amazing that we're getting this like basically this direct feedback. So even that question and the framing, right, of like, why is it either or? Why, what, you know, that's the kind of feedback that we need to have and that we want to have. And I think there's also the question of like, how do we start to kind of like create that regular body? And I think the EJAC is a part of this conversation too, that we're thinking about. And again, like trying to coordinate those efforts all together. So I'm super bummed out that I can't say it's really because I have 2 kids that are like at my door. But I know Crystal is on from the EJ unit. I mean, obviously we've been working very closely with Rich and with Heather and everyone at TTD. So I will definitely follow up. And I think if anybody wants to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to drop my information in the chat to kind of keep the conversation going. But just really wanted to thank everybody for joining. And I think just to kind of continue to encourage, like, yeah, keep pushing us and keep being direct, because it's really going to make us, I think, better. And I think the ultimate goal to me is like thinking about that collaboration and partnership. So thank you guys again so much.
Thank you, Chanel.
Before we move on to the, I see there's a few more hands up there, but I'm also looking at the, at the time. And so what I'm going to propose is that we move forward and we come back during the next topic session with the folks that have their raised hand up first, just to make sure that we have a chance to get through most of the content. And so, so I don't know if Nick is ready to share his screen. We'll just kind of do that really, really quickly on some of the comments that were captured.
Hi, Rich. Yeah, I was trying to synthesize comments as best I can. These are some of what I have at the moment, taken from both the verbal and in the chat. I'll try to make that a little bigger.
Yeah, and so these are captured at a high level, just to get a good sense of what was being discussed. Go ahead and just take a quick 30 seconds and take a look at that. And if there's something that needs some clarification, or if it leads itself to additional comment, go ahead and share that in the chat, and then also provide Amanda your contact information so we know who we need to follow up with. And so I think a couple of the big themes that I heard, I mean, there was several. A lot of folks didn't like the first poll question, and we did discuss that. And so I appreciate those comments. And another comment I just wanted to highlight was, community groups and members actually having, a seat, on the decision-making boards, and not just being in the position of responding to what's occurring. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the rail yard presentation, and we'll have more opportunity for comments. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ajay Mangat for that presentation. Ajay?
Thanks, Rich. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ajay Mangat, and I manage the freight systems section at CARB. I'd like to reiterate appreciation for all of you taking time out of your day to join us. Next, or actually, this is the first slide. So now we're basically shifting the topic from ports to kind of hone in on rail yards. I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists from CARB on this topic. We have Layla for locomotives. You'd heard from her, Jessica for drayage trucks, Leah for TRUs, David and Din for the cargo handling equipment side of things. We also have Rebecca from our enforcement division. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Nicole already went through an overview of the equipment that operates at a port if you joined us for the first part of the session, and I know we're a little bit running behind schedule. So a lot of the same equipment operates at a rail yard, minus the commercial harbor craft and the larger ocean-going vessels. So this slide shows the sources of diesel exhaust that may operate in a rail yard. A lot of this equipment has come a long way in cleaning up emissions due to previous CARB regulations and efforts that have, for the most part, been implemented. However, we really need to make the next push towards zero emission equipment. I know we just had a conversation about that as well. So if we can get the next slide. The exhaust coming from this equipment is diesel engine exhaust, and one component of that exhaust is diesel particulate matter that is comprised of very tiny particles that have the potential to travel deep into the lungs, and some are even small enough to travel into the bloodstream. So this slide lists conditions that have been shown to be linked to the exposure of diesel exhaust. Next slide, please. And I had touched on the need to push towards zero emissions in all sectors. And here we outline the governor's executive order that echoes that robust push. As you can see, the EO directs CARB to propose strategies that move all equipment on a trajectory towards zero emission over the next few decades. Next slide, please. And we're kind of repurposing some of these slides, but I wanted to hone in for this part of the conversation that these are the upcoming regulations, and they'll include components not only for cleaner combustion, but also incorporate zero emission priorities. So the ones that are relevant to rail yards are the regulations for locomotives, advanced clean fleets, TRUs, and cargo handling equipment that are all slated to be presented to our board later this year, next year, and in 2023. Next slide. And with that, I'll just wrap up the rail yard portion. If you'd like more information, you could always send us an email to the address shown on this slide, which is freight@arb.ca.gov. Our website is also a resource to keep track of the regulatory engagement schedules as listed on this page as well. And we encourage you to take a look and also be a part of the process. With that, I'll turn it back over to Rich.
Oh, there we go. There's my mute button. Thanks, Ajay. All right, so we do have a couple of more poll questions. So, Amanda, could we go ahead and get those up, and then we'll open the floor for discussion, starting with Kevin and Raphael. I do believe they still have their hands up. All right, this question here, please rank the following reporting requirements by importance to you. So there are a couple of options there: type of equipment, equipment emission level, amount each equipment type is operated, zero emission equipment operation, zero emission infrastructure utilization. And then if you have another item of importance, go ahead and select other and drop what that is into the chat so that we can see that. And I'll pause for a little bit before saying which one's going to be first, second, or third, just in case there's some last minute changes coming up. But it does look like equipment emission level is leading, followed by zero emission equipment operation. We'll go ahead and give this poll question just another few seconds. Looks like we're getting close to some stability. And I just got proven wrong. All right, so let's take the next question. So this question, CARB plans to publish information on his website. What other means of communicating this data are important to you? So this is kind of just a general question about how it's best to communicate with you, not specific to rail yards, but more overarching. So a couple of options there: cell phone accessible website, periodic public meetings, or in-person periodic public meetings, I should say, virtual periodic public meetings such as this one, publication in a specific language, or other. And if you select other, please go ahead and drop that in the chat just so we can know what's on your mind. So I'm seeing an interesting result with cell phone accessible websites. And then for number 2, it's looking like virtual public meeting. So on the cell phone accessible websites, I would assume there, and folks can drop in the chat if it's something different, that the current issue is just font sizing and things like that and presentation layer not really being conducive to an easy to follow delivery on a smaller screen. And virtual public meetings is number 2. So one question I had about that, you could drop it in the chat. I mean, we're heading toward the path where things are going to be becoming more open. And so are the virtual public meetings something that folks would like to see continue irregardless of that? So it just becomes part of a standard way of operating. All right, we'll give this one a few more seconds. Okay, we'll go ahead and close it. And there was a quick comment on there about the virtual public meetings allowing more people to participate. Okay, we'll go ahead and take some more comments, questions and suggestions. And let's go ahead and start with Alyssa. Let's start with Kevin and Raphael, who patiently waited to the next segment.
All right, I'll call on Kevin Hamilton.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you, CARB staff, for your presentation tonight. Always appreciate learning a little bit more about what's happening in this area. Couple of things. 5-6 years ago, I was a big champion of natural gas heavy-duty trucks. At that point, I really felt like we couldn't see our way through to a battery electric just kind of technology. But technologies move much quicker than I think a lot of us would have ever anticipated, and here we are. We have that solution. Maybe not for long haul, but there's no excuse for a truck running back and forth from one end of the port. Just to be clear, it is a port of Stockton, which often gets left out of these conversations, that it should be a diesel truck. In fact, some of us started noticing the industry last year beginning to really buy up a lot of 2016, 17, and 18, much cleaner diesels. Absolutely cleaner than prior to 2010, no doubt about it, but still a diesel with diesel emissions, black carbon everywhere, NOx. In these valleys and in Los Angeles and here in the San Joaquin and the rest of the Inland Empire, which are the dirtiest air basins in the nation. So we continue to move in that direction and support it. Why am I worried about this? Well, because with SB1, these folks got a break. We talk about life cycle for trucks and people needing to get their investment back out of them. All true. They got that gift last year with SB1 with a 13-year or an 18-year life cycle where it doesn't matter what CARB does. You can't make them change at this point. They get to keep that truck that long. So they're pretty smart. They start buying those cleaner diesels now because they're cheaper than the electric and easier to maintain with the workforce they have without having to upgrade their workforce. And so that's what we're left with. And they're going to have them now, and they're going to have them for the next 10 to 20 years. While we're still wishing that, wow, what if we had just changed the incentives at this point so we de-incentivize diesel and really massively incentivize electric solutions? We have those. We know for medium duty and for light heavy duty, we are good. For heavy duty, less than 140, 150 miles, we are good. For all light duty, we are good. So why are we still providing incentives to combustion engines of any type, natural gas or diesel? You know, it just doesn't make sense. So it looks like for the next 4 years, at least, we're going to continue to do that. And again, that doesn't make sense. We want the industry to produce more of these trucks. We got to start ordering more. Sure, they're expensive to produce, but like any other vehicle, they get cheaper over time. So I'm really curious about the rationale here from the agency. You know, I get you have to listen to everybody, but it just doesn't make sense to keep incentivizing something that we really want to shut down. We really want to get rid of, especially with this idea that everything bought between now and 2023 could still be around 20 years from now, when we'll be far into either full electric or hydrogen electric hybrids. And, you know, people in these communities, they'll still be breathing those emissions. So that makes no sense to me at all. That black carbon still affecting our climate. Again, makes no sense to me at all. So we need to get a little urgent about this, a little more urgent than we have been. And again, I realize it's an agency, so the speed of a snail is about where we can go. But we need to pick that up to turtle or frog speed at this point and get this thing hopping. So that's my last metaphor for the night, by the way. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that.
Sorry, I was muted. Raphael.
Hi, thank you. So a little about me. I'm also not only a member of an EJ team within the city of Los Angeles, but I'm also a resident of an EJ community. And for the past, let's say 17 years, I've been trying to quote unquote infiltrate as a member of the community that's really, wanting to get involved in various EJ programs. I've joined almost every committee that I possibly can. And, while having kind of a seat at the table, I really don't. And, it's difficult because now, I'm seen in the community as one of these agency type people that, I'm now part of the machine. And I think it becomes difficult and very challenging to really try to make an effective change in some of the rules and whatnot, when you have, lots of good work being done, let's say, for instance, in the ports. But yet, as you start getting into these EJ communities, because we're seeing a lot of expansion of let's say, the rail yards and the various other locations, like for instance, since I'm in LA, we have a great, net, if you will, around the port of LA, and making sure that everything coming into and out of are clean trucks and clean idle and electrifying and all these incentives and whatnot. But yet, as you start heading into the EJ community, the problem is a lot of these dirtier trucks, these drayage trucks, are coming into our community, and because of the expansion, more things are put on rail in order to get shipped out of the port area. And by the way, the Alameda corridor, I found out it has the infrastructure for electrification, but yet no electrification is being utilized, which is just a travesty, because taxpayers have invested millions of dollars into the Alameda corridor project, but yet here we do not have electrification of the locomotives and whatnot. Yet we have infrastructure there that's not being utilized, but now they're wanting to take that out and expand the Alameda corridor by adding another rail yard or another rail line, which is unfortunate. But again, a lot of these cleaner incentives and areas that are within the EJ community, we just continue to suffer. A lot of black carbon, a lot of PM 2.5, PM 10 emissions, all these various exhausts and whatnot from combustion engines, and even more of the dirtier rather than the cleaner burning diesel locomotives are found at the port rather than in the EJ communities, and that just increasingly becomes a problem. And I just, at this point, I'm real frustrated because I was trying to play an outside game, now an inside game. And, I'm just trying to ultimately affect a positive change for our community. And we just keep seeing, people moving in and out of these various agencies and essentially starting from scratch, where a lot of the community has continued to live and become more and more frustrated because, we're just giving up fight because, I just don't know what to do. It's continually very, very frustrating for the community. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The next person with their hand up is Andrea.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea. I'm with the People's Collective for Environmental Justice out of the Inland Empire. So as we're talking about the regulations and things that we want to do, I just wanted to bring up a couple of things. One of them being that as we're talking about this, there's massive growth of rail happening. And I want to point to an example of Union Pacific wanting to put a pop-up terminal or whatever that means in Colton. And as we're driving down right now through the freeway, all you see is stacks of containers. And it almost looks like you're driving by the Port of LA, like really close to the Port of Long Beach, but they're on the side of the freeway, because they're growing, right? They're massive. And San Bernardino at the rail yard for BNSF, I mean, people's homes were taken away years ago, and they're still growing in that area. And so, with us, we have thousands of trucks in the Inland Empire going in and out, right? And some of those are long haul. And I know there's long hauls that are happening throughout the state. And in my mind, similar to what Kevin said, if there's long haul trips, there's no reason that those trips shouldn't be put onto rail and taken to their destination. But that's conflicting for me because the rail yards are so dangerous. They're absolutely dangerous places to live by because of the health impacts and what growing up there means. So like a part of me is like, we need to be more efficient on how we're moving cargo, but this, in the way we're doing it now, would probably hurt more people. And so, which gets me to this point about how we really need to figure out how to electrify these rail yards so that we can get there. I mean, we need to get into the modern times of the rail yards, and places in Europe and in Asia and in Africa, right? They all have electrified rail systems, right? And, the whole purpose of, the way that they opened up the conversation today was about environmental racism. And the reason why we're still stuck with oil and gas in our communities is because of that. The reason we have these dated rail systems is because of that. So, this should be a giant priority. And as this is happening, I also want to bring up the fact that, there's this high-speed rail project, zero emissions, for passenger rail. And it's so exciting, but at the cost of who? At the cost of the Colton rail yard that is supposed to expand so that they can use the rail lines to have the high-speed rail in. So how is that just, right? So how is CARB tackling these things happening at the same time as we're working on regulations to electrify, right? Because we're talking about environmental justice, then these are like blatant examples of environmental racism happening right now with how we're planning out rail systems, both for passenger and for freight. And so I'll just end it here and bringing up the fact that, in Colton, we have a rail yard right in front of a high school, right? And that's the one that's growing for the high-speed rail if it goes through. And in San Bernardino, we have a rail yard right in front of a park, right in front of it. And so these attract thousands of trucks a day, thousands, hundreds at least an hour, right? And we have, CARB has the opportunity with regulation, the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, to really target a lot of these trucks that are doing short trips, right? Either they're coming from the ports or they're coming from somewhere outside to go onto the rail or whatever. My second question for CARB is, what's CARB doing to expand the efficiency of the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule? And what are we doing to make sure that we target all of these trucks that are doing short trips in our area that could be easily electrified? So like, how do we address the easily electrified short trips that are happening in our communities at the same time that we're electrifying rail so we can get at these harder to electrify services. So I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I'll open it up to a panelist if they want to address any of Andrea's questions or comments.
Yeah, let me just say thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. You know, like you said, sometimes we have to look to other examples, you know, who's doing it right, where. And like you said, you kind of look to, you know, some other examples where they are electrifying a lot of the freight movement. So I appreciate that. Sometimes, you know, we get focused on what we're doing right here, and, you know, really there's great examples everywhere. So, you know, the one thing, you know, we'll go back to is, you know, when we're talking about the trucks and, you know, where the technology is and, you know, where do we start? We recognize a lot of the truck traffic at the rail yards and at the ports. They're operating in your communities. And, you know, we are looking at, you know, how do we start there first? You know, those aren't the ones that are on the main freeways. They're driving in front of your schools. They're driving in front of your parks. So the rail yard trucks are also included in what we call the drayage rulemaking. So it's both the port and the rail yard. And obviously there's some interaction between the two, between the port and the rail yard. The trucks are going to both. Sometimes they're separate fleets, but we're looking at both of those. So they'll be included in that first initial take as we look at transitioning the heavy duty sector for freight operating at the port and the rail yard. So, you know, the zero emission equipment, we have a lot of optimism about where it's going right now. We're looking at how do we align that infrastructure. I kind of feel like we're forward looking in that. We're trying to, like, how do we start as soon as possible? And, you know, we appreciate your voice. You know, I've had other opportunities to participate in the community meetings, and I appreciate this as well, because it also reminds us that, you know, these are people's communities. You know, we're looking at kind of a different fleet, different sectors, you know, but people do live there. I know where you're talking about in San Bernardino. I had family that lived down there, and it does look like that along the freeway. You drive along the freeway, and it does kind of look like an inland port. You have stacks and stacks of containers there. And, you know, there's a lot more than just the emissions that's going on there. There's the beautification of the neighborhood. So I just want to say thank you. And, you know, your comments, you're being heard. And, you know, we are looking to start in 2023. That's really as fast as we can go with the rulemaking. And I know Kevin said we're slow as snails, and he would be absolutely right, but there is a process that we have to go through. And we are looking at where can we start as soon as possible so we start to address these things, especially for the trucks, because as we all saw in the polls and all the history every time, it's been like that in the past. You know, the trucks are in the neighborhoods, you know. So anyways, I will let anybody else respond, but I just wanted to say, you know, add that to your comment. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just checking. I don't see any other raised hands. And so were there any other comments folks wanted to make on this topic? Otherwise, we can move to the next one, and we'll have another opportunity for comment as well.
Before we do that, Rich, I want to see if there are anyone on the phone who have questions. I believe you could push *6 to unmute yourself. All right. It looks like none from the Spanish conference line, but if anyone is joining on their telephone, if they have a question, you can also unmute yourself. So it doesn't sound like it. If we want to proceed, Rich.
Okay, let me ask Jen to go ahead and share her screen with some of the comments we captured just from this segment. And I'll give her a second to get that up.
Sorry, Rich, I keep hearing share screen and I'm putting the presentation up. That's my fault.
Oh, okay.
Hey, I'm working on it here. Okay, that's the right one. Can you see a screen?
Yes, we see it. And so just like before, I mean, so these are some of the, the comments that we captured again at a higher level. And so just take a quick look at those. And if there's anything that needs clarity or if it spurs any additional comments, go ahead and drop those into the, into the chat so that we can take a look at those. And
I'm going to roll this screen in another few seconds because there's another page.
And again, we'll make these notes publicly available so folks can take a more detailed look at those.
Rich, did someone already say whether we plan to post this video, this recording?
The recording will be posted, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more topic.
Okay, I'm going to stop
for the evening.
I'm trying to stop sharing.
There we go. Okay, we have one more topic, and that is border crossings. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Andre Freeman, who's going to walk us through a brief presentation on that.
Great, thanks, Rich. So good evening, everyone. My name is Andre Freeman. I'm the manager of the Freight Policy section here at CARB. This last section we'll go over the land ports of entry, otherwise known as the border crossings, where significant truck traffic goes between the United States and Mexico. Next slide. So the land ports of entries are facilities that provide controlled entry into and out of the United States. This includes both people and cargo. As you can see from these photos, California's crossings include a significant amount of truck traffic. Please note the line of trucks in the upper left photo. This is a continuing issue that we want to highlight. I know a lot of people think about the number of trucks going across the border, but we also want to highlight the fact that there are significant queues and lines of trucks where they just sit there and idle outside of the border crossing. So while they're moving or while they're stationary, they're causing significant public health impacts. Next slide. So as you can see here, the land ports of entry represented by the orange dots, hopefully folks can zoom in and see those, are strategically located near the major transportation corridors, ranging from the eastern to western sides of the border. There are residential areas, there are warehouses, distribution facilities, manufacturing facilities on both sides of the border by these crossings. So, whether people are at work or they're at home, these crossings pose significant health impacts to folks living there. Next slide. So to give you an idea of the volume of truck traffic and commerce taking place at the border, this slide shows a number of truck crossings that take place each year. With the continued growth of commerce between the United States and Mexico, we aren't looking at just the emissions produced by these trucks today, but also looking at additional issues that the future may hold. So you'll see the second port identified there where you said the future Otay Mesa East crossing. That primarily is being developed to handle some of the increased freight growth that we expect to happen in the coming decades. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell on this too much. I think we're all aware of the public health impacts that this air pollution causes us. So, we can probably just skip over this to the next slide, please. So as we mentioned before, CARB has a suite of freight regulations meant to handle all different types of freight equipment that are operating both at these land port of entries, other freight facilities on both sides of the border and throughout the state. We talked about the suite of truck regulations that we have in place. You'll see some of the historical ones, which are really focused on cleaner diesel vehicles, and then the advanced clean truck regulation and the advanced clean fleet regulations, which are really focused on turning these trucks over to be zero emission vehicles as soon as possible. So next slide. So with that, here's our contact information if you have questions, and feel free to open it up for a discussion.
All right, thanks, Andre. Before we get to the discussion, we have another poll question. Put that up there. And so this is an open-ended, free-form type question. And so what are your specific concerns or interests regarding land border crossings? And so there should be like a box in there for you to type your responses. And then I noticed that somebody was having an issue with their Wi-Fi. And so you can use your cell phone and send a text to CARB EJ OCAP 306 or text 22333 to CARB EJ OCAP 306 and participate that way. And so 2 are coming in so far, offloading emissions to Mexico. So touching upon a little leakage issues there. Trucks, different emission standards. So I assume different emission standards between California, the US, and Mexico. The idling car these days, when idling turn on and off automatically, can similar technology be implemented in trucks? That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that one from a technology point of view, but it's an interesting question. Okay, so it looks like, oh, there we go, long lines of trucks, and I assume that's at the border crossing itself. Emissions from trucks going into and out of US, Mexico, into EJ communities. Doesn't SB 210 cover emissions from truck coming into California? Would this include international freight? So that might be a good topic for the panel to opine on in a second. We'll give this one just another 30 seconds since folks have to type in their responses. So again, the question is, what are your specific concerns or interests regarding land border crossings? Okay, let's go ahead and close it. I think we're good there. And then we'll open the floor for discussion on this topic. And if there's any lingering questions or comments from our first 2 topics, those are welcome as well during this time period. So Alyssa, do we have any comments? I'm not seeing any raised hands at the moment.
I'm not seeing any raised hands. Are there any questions from anyone on the phone? You can push *6 to unmute. Are there any questions from the Spanish conference line? All right, we have none there either. Oh, we have one hand up. Kevin.
That's a question.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. So a quick question, and if the answer is what I think it is, and I'm not sure, and again, and happily my good friend Luis Almeida is not on right now to talk about cross-border issues in his community, which are such a problem for them since they moved the entire truck access portal to Imperial County. So many people don't know that trucks don't cross in TJ anymore. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong, that's my understanding. Also, that Mexican trucks can't travel any more than a few miles or 30 miles into the US without a special permit. So given those two facts, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, we still are dealing every day with this mythos that is raised by many people, especially around immigration related issues, that somehow Mexican trucks are the cause of all of our air pollution here in California, or a good chunk of it, especially in SoCal and even in other parts of the United States. So again, if the two first statements I made are accurate, I would really request that CARB do a much better job and really needs a full-blown marketing campaign to get the word out once and for all that this is not true, and that people need to quit beating this drum, which is both anti-immigrant and anti-clean air. So it just gets in the way of the conversation, but I still hear it regularly. So it's become part of the belief that many, many people, I would bet there's people on this call right now who believe that. So I'll leave that to you folks to correct me or give us the facts with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Is there anyone on the panel that would like to respond to Kevin?
Yeah, thanks for your comments, Kevin. We can definitely talk about degrees of, which standards various types of diesel engines are meeting. So if you have a diesel powered truck, whether it's based out of Mexico or based out of the United States, or based out of California compared to other states, I think the fact remains that if it's a diesel vehicle, there's some kind of public health impact associated with it. So yes, as people are trying to demonize trucks coming from certain areas or another, we're really trying to focus people on the fact that as long as these vehicles are producing emissions, there will be a public health impact, and that's really reinforcing our drive to zero emission vehicles, which is the only solution that kind of addresses this across the board. But thank you for your comments, and ground truthing these things is definitely going to be a continuing importance for us.
Kevin, it looks like your hand is still raised. I'll unmute you to see if you had a response.
Thank you. I'm managing the technology here, trying to. So that didn't answer my question. I certainly agree with you, Andre. No doubt about it. I mean, we've been saying that all night long. I don't think anybody hasn't or doesn't support that. The speed at which that happens, I think, is the big question that everybody has. We want to go faster. Industry wants a better pace. Still not confirming whether or not, and again, if there's no one on the panel who has the answer to this, whether or not the portal into the US in California has completely moved to Calexico at this point. Again, that's my understanding. I've been down there a number of times now, standing at that border, and you can see the nonstop truck traffic. In fact, there's a special gate just for them, and right adjacent to it, of course, live a lot of very poor people. And then the idea that these trucks, without a special single destination permit, can't travel more than a few miles into the US without having to disconnect their load and hand it off to an American truck. So please, if you could answer that. Is that accurate? I hate it if I don't have the accurate information, so please help me there.
Well, I'll help you with the first question, Kevin. Amanda, could you bring up the slides again and go to the graphic that shows how many truck crossings there are? So Kevin, your original question, yes, the Tijuana crossing is closed to commercial activity.
Right.
So that one right there. So these are the ports of entry that we're talking about that have the major commercial freight movements. So
I can't actually see it. It's a little too small. I think that was the problem before. I can't.
So I'll read it out. So it's the Calexico crossing that you're referencing is the one on the far right. The Tecate one is the one just to the left of that. And then the two Otay Mesa crossings are the large ones on the
That's
left.
the biggest one, right?
Yeah.
So again, all of those are in Imperial County, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, launching right into Calexico and Hebron and the communities.
Yeah, and then also the major freight rail traffic that goes to and from Mexico also goes through Calexico as well.
So what about how far Mexican trucks can travel into the United States? Do you have that answer by chance?
I do not. Tony, do you happen to know the answer to that question?
Tony, you know all things freight, man. Come on.
Sorry. No, I cannot be certain. I know there's some limitations, but I don't know enough to give you an accurate response.
Great. Maybe we could get that for later. I was told that unless they had a
Yes.
single destination permit, like we're going to Denver, they cannot stop other than, for a break anywhere in between. They cannot divert and they cannot carry another load to any locations. It's straight there and back. And they have to meet all our emission requirements at the place they cross the border and in the United States. So again, the myth is out there. It's used all the time in the Valley. I hear board members at the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District still say this, and it's getting in the way. So, if somebody could demystify this and give us something we can lean on, somebody to refer to, that would be great.
Kevin, this is Tony. I mean, the one thing I can add is that the regulations that we have apply equally to the trucks, whether they come from Mexico, Canada, or anywhere else. So they are subject to the same requirement when they do operate here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. And the next person we have with their hand up is Lonnie.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Good evening, everyone. This is Lonnie from First Generation Environmental Health and Economic Development from the Bayview Hunters Point community. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now, is something I'm sure we've been talking about for years. Truckers been around for years. A lot of things are, they've been around for years, but they've been polluting for years. We know about this situation, and just to go on and on, it can be nerve-wracking. We have a situation in the Bayview Hunters Point community where we have a homeless shelter surrounded by two toxic waste industry. We got a concrete, company and who hasn't had a permit in over 20 years, and then we got Recology, the trucking company, and these trucks are going constantly every day spreading that. And the concrete, I think, is respirable. I was just reading up on that, and they advise that anyone who is working around that type of dust or particle shouldn't inhale it no more than 8 hours. But yet we have a homeless shelter right next door, not far. Trucks coming in and out daily. The same with the concrete plant. And I look at this, how can you operate a facility without a permit? It's almost like you go to a restaurant. I'm sure no one is going to go to a restaurant that haven't been inspected in like 2, 3, or 4 years. They're not, because something is not right. So how do you go that many years without your restaurant being inspected? There has to be a hazardous. And then there's people getting sick. We have to do something, about this situation. This is very urgent. People are inhaling this stuff constantly on a daily basis. And it's 125 trailers that homeless shelter has in that spot, surrounded by that. I know. It's a difficult process right now. But when people's lives are at stake, something has to be done. And the thing about it is that the air district, no one won't go out and measure PM 2.5. I don't get it. Why? It doesn't make any sense. No one wants to measure PM 2.5. We keep asking over and over and over. And so the only way, those organizations, grassroots organizations, got their feet on the ground, who care about their communities, who live in a community, breathe that stuff, need help and assistance when it comes to funding to educate and support and do research to educate the people in that community. People are dying slowly and they don't even know it. When you go to the hospital, the doctors don't know why. If we told them what we were inhaling, what we were breathing, then maybe they can help us. But they can't. They'll put us on some medication or some drug that individuals become addicted to. It's not right. Something needs to be done about that. And this community, that trailer, homeless shelter is 95% Black people. That is environmental racism, to put those individuals in the midst, surrounded by the naval shipyard, by the railroad, where they had containers. When I was on the Restoration Rising Board, the cleanup of the shipyard, this is toxic waste, radioactive. They will put it in the containers and then they will ship it off. But here's the thing, they will sit in those containers for months before they will move them. This is radioactive waste. And the homeless shelters, the railroads is right behind the homeless shelter. I mean, directly, not even no more than 15 yards. And those containers sit right there. But I don't know what's in those containers right now, but they're just sitting there. So it's an issue, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Thank you for taking the time to hear me. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Lonnie, for those those comments. And it's unfortunate that you've had some challenges with the the local air district in looking at some of those concerns. But I appreciate you sharing that with us. Okay, I'm gonna.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do a quick time check. I'm just looking at our time, and I do want to be respectful of people's time. We do have a few more poll questions, but before we put those up, I just wanted to remind folks of part 2 on Thursday, starting at 5 o'clock, where the topics will be warehouses, airports, and our Seaport process. So make sure to reserve some time on your calendar for that. And so, Amanda, let's go ahead with the last few poll questions, and then we can go ahead and close out here. These are just a series of questions we asked just to kind of get a pulse of how the meeting went and what's coming up in the future, and just how we, the best ways to reach out to you. So the first one here is, what is the best way for you to participate in upcoming CARB rulemaking opportunities? You've heard about one today here. So we got, workshops, increased use of community-centered blogs, more remote participation opportunities. And I think we did hear a comment about virtual meetings before, more evening community center meetings with CARB staff, in person or remote. I think a good thing to indicate in the chat is what's a good time block for folks when we talk about evening meetings. So we're starting these at 5. Is that a good time, or should we be looking at making some adjustments to that? And then if you choose to use other, go ahead and drop in the chat what you're thinking about there. And it does look like more evening community-centered meetings with CARB staff. Is leading by far.
And Rich, just for context for folks who haven't participated in our workshops before, what we're calling workshops here are meetings where we're going to spend a majority of the time talking, doing large presentations, getting into all the technical details, whereas our evening community meetings are really focused on getting input from community members, limiting the amount of talking we're doing.
Yes, thank you, Andre. And then one thing I'm noticing is nobody has selected B, the increased use of community-centered blogs. And so it'd be good to know in the chat what concerns folks may have with using blogs and why those aren't a good communication metric. Okay, let's try the next question. How can CARB best support needed actions in your community? So a couple of options: participate in regular community meetings, engage with Air District and community on AB 617 community issues, provide air toxics curriculum and other informational materials, consider opportunities for community-specific regulation. And then, of course, if there's an option that's not listed here, you can indicate other, and again, give us some details in the chat. And I notice there's some, so there's one comment I just want to point out from Mary Elizabeth. I think you need to have those workshops in the evening too, and that's a good observation. And so on this question here, engage with Air District and community on AB 617 community issues. If you have some thoughts about how that looks and how that would best work for you, we'd be interested in seeing that in the, in the chat as well. Especially since that's the option that appears to be universally selected. Okay, and the next question, I think we just got one more after this next one here. What topics are you interested in for future meetings? And so we do use the response, we ask this question each of our sessions, and we do use that to inform which topic we discuss next. And so we have assessing cumulative impacts, CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, commercial hovercraft. Of course, we have a regulation that is being developed for that, composite wood. We have an existing ATCM there, and we're working on amendments to those: health risk assessment, pesticides, trucks, and that covers a broad range: drayage trucks, fleets, TRUs, transportation refrigeration units. And then again, if there's any other, go ahead and drop those into the chat. And so I see health risk assessment and CEQA kind of leading. And so one thing would be good to know, when you see the term health risk assessment, and if there was going to be a session on that, what would you like to see discussed? The same thing with CEQA, what would you like to see discussed? One of the things that the agency does, and it does come out of Transportation and Toxics Division and our Office of Community Air Protection, we do comment on various CEQA projects, mostly freight related, warehouses, rail yards, seaports, and and whatnot. And so anything you would want to discuss in a session about CEQA would be helpful. And I see some thoughts on composite wood and pesticide. as well. I see no one has selected commercial hovercraft. So we do have some regulatory activity going on there, amendments to the current rule, and right now those are scheduled to be heard by the board this November 2021. Okay, I see some stability here. Let's take that last question, Amanda, the last poll question. Let me get a little pie chart here. Would you be interested in attending more meetings like this? This should be, the options are pretty simple: yes, no, unsure. Right now it's all yes, but if somebody's thinking about responding no or unsure, that's okay. We would just like you to drop in the chat what concerns you might have about this particular form or the structure and how we can make it better, or what changes we would need to make in order to make it more beneficial for you and want to attend. So I'm liking that I'm seeing a universal yes so far. Okay, let's go ahead and close this one, and let's share the notes real quick. Because I skipped over those from the first time. So this was the notes that we had captured from the border crossing section, and I think there was a couple of questions in there that perhaps staff will be able to dive into. Question from Kevin about how far into California can Mexican or can Mexican trucks go, and just trying to get some answers on some of those things what's going on there with Calexico and whatnot. But again, just like the other two, if there's some clarifications that are needed or some additional questions that you think might need to be asked, go ahead and drop those into the chat so that we can have those captured. And again, all these notes that we've captured will be made available publicly. And so with that, just noting the time, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. And I see there's a good number of you that stuck it out past 70, past 7. So I appreciate that. And again, hope to see everybody on Thursday at 5 for part 2 of this discussion. So thank you all for participating, and thank you, panelists. And everybody enjoy the rest of your evening.